power of the administrative state to impose radical and unpopular policies that could never be passed by Congress violates the separation of powers established by the Constitution and is a failed business model for running a country. The two bills that I am here to discuss today will help restore Congress's legislative primacy, increase the accountability of policymakers to the American people, and rein in the administrative state. Neither of these bills should be controversial. The first is H.R. 277, the Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, also known as the REINS Act. This bill is extremely important to Congress reclaiming its rightful authority and responsibility to legislate. I therefore think it is important that we focus on the purpose of the bill rather than on extraneous matters that are more politically motivated than policy-oriented. According to Section 2, titled Purpose, the purpose of this act is to increase accountability for and transparency in the federal regulatory process. Section 1 of Article 1 of the United States Constitution grants all legislative powers to Congress. Over time, however, Congress has excessively, and I would argue unlawfully, delegated its unconstitutional charge while failing to conduct appropriate oversight and retain accountability for the content of the laws that it passes. By requiring a vote in Congress, the REINS Act will result in more carefully drafted and detailed legislation and improve regulatory process, and a legislative branch that is truly accountable to the American people for the laws imposed upon them. Now again, what I can't figure out is why anyone would oppose this. The REINS Act is drafted to address what is often referred to as the NonDelegation Doctrine, which is a judicially created concept that has resulted in a dramatic shift in power and accountability from the legislative branch to the executive branch. The non-delegation doctrine is what has justified moving regulatory power from Congress to the agencies. It is what has allowed regulatory agencies to adopt regulations and even guidance documents that may impose economic costs in the billions of dollars on certain industries and businesses, and ultimately on the American people, without any congressional oversight or involvement at all. The current state of affairs, in other words, has empowered unelected bureaucrats to legislate without any accountability whatsoever, and allowed members of Congress to abdicate the most important power they have, the power to write the laws. Not only is this bad policy, but it violates Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, which reads, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives." So what does the REINS Act actually do? The REINS Act requires Congress to affirmatively approve major rules, including those agency rules with an annual effect on the economy of at least $100 million before they can become effective. Prior legislative attempts to rein in the administrative state have been insufficient. For example, in 1996, Congress passed the Congressional Review Act, or as it is better known, the CRA. The CRA provided Congress with a legislative veto mechanism over agency rulemaking, allowing Congress to disapprove of the agency rules within a prescribed period of time after its issuance. However, the CRA has been used to overturn only 20 rules to date, not because Congress hasn't tried, but as with the current administration, we are met with a presidential veto when we move to do so. As an example, just in the 118th Congress, both the House and the Senate passed legislation to overturn the unlawful WOTUS rule as issued by the EPA, to overturn the tariff repeal on solar panels made in China, and to overturn the radical ESG requirements issued by federal agencies. Yet each of those times, the President of the United States vetoed the actions of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And for example, in 2021, Congress passed just 143 laws, while federal agencies issued 3,257 rules. So when we hear the argument that Congress simply does not have the time to address these matters or to oversee rules that would have an effect of over $100 million, the argument just simply is untrue. We just need to do our jobs. The REINS Act would help to remedy these problems. It would invert the CRA's standard of legislative disapproval in favor of requiring affirmative congressional approval of major agency rules before they take effect. It requires Congress to do as our founding fathers expected and to carry out our constitutional duties, which is to legislate. The REINS Act puts legislative power back in the hands of the legislative branch, which is Congress. The REINS Act also promotes electoral accountability by giving elected representatives a larger role in policymaking and unaccountable bureaucrats a smaller one. Again, I cannot fathom why anyone on the legislative side of the aisle would oppose such accountability or such course correction of this legislative ship. The second bill I'm here to discuss is H.R. 288, the Separation of Powers Restoration Act, or SOPRA. SOPRA amends Section 706 of the Administrative Procedure Act. And as amended, Section 706 would read as follows. To the extent necessary to decision and when presented, the reviewing court shall determine the meaning or applicability of the terms of an agency action and decide de novo all relevant questions of law, including the interpretation of constitutional and statutory provisions and rules made by agencies. Very simple. Again, I cannot understand why anyone would oppose such a common sense requirement that our courts actually do their jobs, which is to interpret the law. SOPRA requires nothing more than to apply de novo review to all questions of law, including agencies' interpretations of statutes and rules. That's what courts are supposed to do under the Constitution, interpret the law. SOPRA would override the ill-advised Supreme Court precedents like Chevron, USA Incorporated versus Natural Resources Defense Council that require courts to defer to agencies' interpretations of statutes and rules so long as they are reasonable, but not necessarily if they are correct. It would end this improper judicial deference that gives agencies greater leeway to pass rules carrying the force of law and which puts a thumb on the scale in favor of the administrative state and against the American people. By doing so, SOPRA would help to restore the constitutional separation of powers, reclaiming the court's role as the branch that interprets the law and Congress's role as the branch that makes the law. And it also would help to promote the electoral accountability of policymakers by ensuring that it is Congress's policies and not those of unelected bureaucrats that govern the American people. I was also asked to address or introduce my amendment to SOPRA at this time. I believe that SOPRA is a great bill, which I fully support. My amendment, however, is simple and simply clarifies that de novo judicial review would apply to agency guidance as well as to congressional statutes and agency rules. Specifically, my amendment explicitly states that interpretive rules, general statements of policy, and all other agency guidance are subject to de novo judicial review as well. Unlike rules, guidance is undefined in the APA's definition section. Agency guidance consists of interpretive rules that explain how agencies interpret the statutes and rules that they administer, and general statements of policy that prospectively advise how agencies may choose to exercise their authority. Guidance, however, is not subject to the APA's notice and comment requirements, and at least officially should not have the effect of law. Yet we have seen a growing trend of the administrative agencies attempting to use guidance to have the force of law while avoiding the APA process. For example, in my private capacity before being elected to Congress, I was part of an effort challenging the United States Department of Agriculture's efforts to force all of our livestock producers to use RFID ear tags at the cost of $2 billion to the industry. The agency tried to force this on our American farmers and ranchers and cattle producers through a 2-page guidance document that was published on the USDA's website. They did this without any notice or an opportunity to be heard by the regulated industry. Further concerning is that guidance is often not judicially reviewable because agencies will then claim that it is not final agency action. And even when it is reviewed, the government then asks for deference to the agencies from the court. SOPRA is a great bill. While it is implicit in the language that the requirement for de novo judicial review of all relevant questions of laws applies to agency guidance, my amendment would make this explicit. This bill is about reining in the administrative state and preventing it from abusing the federal government's power. My amendment would clarify that agency guidance, which the executive agencies routinely abuse, is subject to the standard of de novo judicial review under the bill. Thank you, and I am happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.